Welcome to part 5 in our series where we're looking at the book of Leviticus in the Old Testament. Now let's just reflect back on the previous presentation where we looked at much of chapter 6 to the end of chapter 7. In that section we saw there were repetition of phrases like, "The Lord spoke to Moses," "This is the law of," making it very clear that God was behind this with authority. And there was emphasis on meticulous detail. The whole sacrificial system and all the details of how to be carried out were spelled out with meticulous detail. You see, these visual actions carried meaning for the people, a people who couldn't read or write, people who had recently escaped from slavery, a people whose background and knowledge was very limited. What they could see, what they could sense, what they could experience carried meaning, and it was teaching them. And what it taught them was this: God, the Lord of the universe, very different from the gods of Egypt. We cannot approach God casually or irreverently. He's so far beyond us. So they were teaching them through the sacrificial system the power and the awesomeness of the God who made everything. And they were encouraged to bring to God the very best they could offer. It symbolized their commitment of themselves to God. The animals that were sacrificed didn't do very much for them because that runs behind it. And that is always true. So often we reduce our religion to a series of ritual practices in all churches of all denominations. And the danger is they can mean nothing. We can go through the system. Fundamentally, it's us that are important, and our heart attitudes, and the way we approach it, and the way we see God. Deep lessons enacted out before the people in the sacrificial system. The writer to the Hebrews, all these years later, reflects back. The law is only a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the realities themselves. For this reason it can never, by the same sacrifices repeated endlessly year after year, make perfect or complete or mature those who draw near to worship. But those sacrifices are an annual reminder of sins, which enacted in front of their eyes. It is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. That's always true. And the writer to the Hebrews sees the answer. Day after day every priest stands and performs his religious duties. Again and again he offers the same sacrifices which can never take away sins. But when this priest, and he's referring to Jesus, when this priest had offered for all time one sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God. A symbol of the whole thing was completed. For by one sacrifice he has made perfect forever those who are being made holy. Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by the sacrifice of himself, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain. That was the curtain that separated off the inner sanctuary. The new and living way that is his body. And since we have a great high priest over the house of God, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart, with full assurance that faith brings, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from guilty conscience, having our bodies washed with pure water. Reflecting back to the symbolism of the sacrificial system. It's a picture of the reality which was to come, which was fulfilled in Jesus. Let's fade it out, because the reality has come. The sacrifices were a shadow of the future. Because Jesus, the great high priest, was also the once and for all sacrifice when he gave his life for humanity on the cross. And no further sacrifice is ever required. And nothing we can do that suggests that we're making a further sacrifice is valid, because he did it once and for all. And the entire priestly system is now redundant. We don't need to have priests carrying these things out for us. We have confidence to enter the most holy place through a new and living way because of Jesus. That's the key. Every human being can access and come into the very presence of God in all his holiness through all that Jesus has done for us in his life, death, and resurrection. He was the great high priest. He is the great high priest, but he is also the perfect sacrifice. Our part? Well, first of all, we need to realize our human rebellion. We all rebel. We all think we know better than God, and we want to run our lives our own way. Doesn't work. God knows the best way. And we need to be willing to respond to Jesus. It only becomes a reality when our heart attitudes are right. We can see all the pictures of the Old Testament sacrificial system pointing us forward, preparing us for what was to happen. And we commit ourselves to the way of Jesus, and in gratitude we respond to him. We thank him for all he's done for us in his life, death, and resurrection. We commit ourselves to live his way. We seek his grace and strength to do it. Now let's move forward. The next chapters move through the idea of holiness, cleanness, and uncleanness. We looked at that in an earlier presentation. Here's one way of looking at it. God made everything and it was good. We mess it up, or the natural events of life mess it up. But things for God need to be whole, complete, separated, perfect. That's holy. So we can pollute, or we can make things holy, set them apart for God. We can clean things up, or we can make things profane. This is the background picture of the next chapters. And amongst other things, sin and disease can take things from left to right. They can mess things up. But the way we respond to God, and we express that response in the Old Testament through a sacrificial system, that can move things from right to left. Now the sacrificial system looks at clean to holy. The next chapters are going to look at unclean to clean, moving things from the right hand to the middle. The writer of the book of Leviticus is coldly logical. But these chapters are sandwiched between two other events. We have seen in the last presentation, towards the end, the failure of the two elder sons of Aaron. They thought, for whatever reasons, that they could play fast and loose with the sacrificial system, and they paid a terrible penalty for it. And in chapter 16 we will come to the description of the events of a specific day, or indeed a week, that happened annually in the life of the nation of Israel, the Day of Atonement. So these are things that happened, and we've got to interpret the chapters of clean and uncleanness in the context of priestly failure at one end and the Day of Atonement at the other. There is a logical sequence to it. And fundamentally these chapters are looking at this. How do you deal with uncleanness? Because uncleanness prevents things being made holy and coming into the tabernacle. It prevents the sacrifices being relevant or possible. How do you move things so that access to God through the tabernacle sacrificial system, that becomes possible for us? That's where cleanness and uncleanness fits, even though the ideas for us today seem very strange. So we've got to see it as sandwiched between two things. The whole sacrificial system and an example of the failure of it. Across the Day of Atonement, the great day happened once in a year, the special day of national sacrifice. So we've got to interpret it in that historical situation. If you start ripping verses out of context, you can make up any kind of theology you like. That's not the way we use other books, and it's not the way the Bible was designed. But the list is very strange to us today. One chapter looks at clean and unclean foods. But then the next chapter looks at childbirth. Well, strictly speaking, it's the events after childbirth. And then there are two chapters that look at skin and fungal diseases, including damage to property. And then chapter 15 looks at aspects of sexual activity. Now, these were all very important parts of life, and they are today, but it seems strange to us why they're put in Leviticus and in that order. But that's an important principle. It's not a rule book. And so often critics of the Bible will look up at some obscure text in Leviticus, usually taking some old version which hasn't quite got the translation right, rip it out of context and then mock us. That's not the way the book was designed. We've got to interpret all this in context to establish fundamental principles that go on. Trouble with rules is they don't go on. They just get in the way. Now let's look at unclean animals. The theme of Leviticus chapter 11, which when we look at it seems a very strange situation. But again, there's careful organization here. The writer sees the animals in terms of land creatures, water creatures, and flying creatures. And we have to remember that the experience of the people would have been very limited, and would be extremely limited with regard to water creatures, because they'd lived in Egypt and then crossed into the desert of the Sinai Peninsula. They're further divided. And then it looks at animals which are dead, just naturally dying or had an accident. So it seems to organize the animal world up in its own way, which is quite sensible. Here's a kind of summary. It looks at various things under various headings and specifies what's clean and what's unclean. Now there's a small caveat we've got to watch here. Because of the language and because of the lack of biological knowledge in the people groups of those days, we're not always 100% sure what animal is being referred to. We're also dealing with a Middle Eastern context of animals thousands of years ago. This is not Western animals. But with that in mind, we get a broad picture. Things that are clean and things that are unclean. Clean regarded as what's normal to them. The unclean, things that are regarded as not normal to them. And so we can summarize it that way. Land animals are fit for eating if they're cloven-hoofed and they chew the cud. Fish if they've got fins and scales. Birds if they eat grain or insects. Insects that hop. These are clean. And the unclean are the rest. So the picture is based here on clean and unclean. Clean is that which conforms to the normal pattern. And it makes some sense for a people group at that time. Let's go back to our picture. Leviticus seems to present clean as a kind of ground state. God made everything clean. And the characteristic of this is wholeness or normality. The way things should be, if you like. And it sees the other two as kind of variations from this norm. You could set apart things for God, and they came from the clean group, but now they are perfect, whereas clean is just normal. And the unclean, things that didn't conform to the standards of wholeness or normality, as seen by the people group of that time. It meant that most foods were in fact open to be eaten, because the other foods would not normally be eaten or be available. They were an agricultural people, and they had the normal chewing of the cud, cloven-hoofed animals. That would be normal. And grain-eating birds would of course be around them when they came into the land, because there was grain growing. Insects-eating birds would be there. So that's the normal pattern for an agricultural people. And it's all open to them. But perfection, we saw that stressed again and again. The pick of the flock. The best for God. These animals are not rejected, they're just rejected for eating. But clean are suitable for eating. So there's kind of three categories of animals, the majority of which are in the middle. That's the pattern. They conform to normality. Now, people have tried to put up reasons why this is so. And if you look at the reasons that people have written about, they come under broadly 5 categories. Why do we have these rules in Leviticus? Why do they follow the pattern they follow? There are those who say they're just arbitrary. God has decided, it's not up to us to question. Now you can see that still repeated in the Islamic world. The Christian world has moved as the New Testament has moved from food rules, but Islam put it back to food rules. Not exactly the same, but similar. And if you discuss it with a Muslim, you'll get a pretty quick response. It's not up to you to question it. God decided. Do it. But that raises interesting questions. It's not the way God works. God, who instructed us to worship Him with our minds as well as everything else. Questioning is encouraged by God, not discouraged. But Islam discourages questioning. So it doesn't seem to fit. So I reject that. Some people have argued that these things, the uncleanness, is because the animals that were unclean were associated with other pagan religions doesn't fit the facts. For example, the bull was a major beast that was associated with pagan religions at the time, and yet the bull was central in the sacrifices for Israel. So that simply can't be true. Some have suggested that the unclean animals can generate disease, and in some cases that's true. However, why did Jesus undermine these food rules? Why does the New Testament reject them? There was no great move forward in hygiene standards by then. Doesn't fit the evidence. Some have argued that the unclean animals have got some kind of symbolism to remind us of wrongdoing. Well, the people who've taken that line have come up with some of the most bizarre speculative ideas. They are simply speculations. So I have to reject that too. What Leviticus focuses on is that there's something deeper behind this. The food rules seem to us strange, and the way of Jesus today doesn't require them. But what's behind it? Because that seems to be the way Leviticus is driving us. It doesn't interpret it in terms of the other four. I mentioned that Jesus had turned away from the food rules, and in fact the context was that he shows us that what we eat, what we take in, it doesn't defile us. It's what's in us that makes a mess of us, our rebellion and sin. Paul makes it clear that all food is accessible. God made everything good. Peter, who followed the food rules, was taught directly by God through a vision that all foods are clean. And Peter, along with James, the brother of Jesus, shows how freedom from food laws is to work out. You find it laid down in Acts 15. So what is the relevance for today? That has to be true. Well, we do mess things up, and Satan messes up the world. That has to be true. So an argument like this might come up. That's how Leviticus handles it. Specific characteristics indicate normality. Normality of animals in an agricultural society. Others fall outside that. Therefore, you don't eat them. Now you can work that through. Pigs and camels don't conform to the norm in an agricultural society. Birds of prey eat raw flesh and blood. So you can interpret that, and you can go on interpreting that, the normal as they saw it, which was part of their society and structure and the culture of the day. So we can see it as kind of practical guidance. It's a former slave group. They're moving into a new life. They needed direction. They needed principles. And God was establishing for them principles of His holiness, the idea of cleanness, that which makes things possible to have access to the tabernacle sacrificial system, and uncleanness, things that mess it up. So there are fundamental principles behind it. Let's look at the actual text at the end that summarizes it. The writer says, "Do not defile yourself by any of these creatures," that's the unclean ones, Do not make yourselves unclean by means of them, or be made unclean by them. I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves. Be holy, because I am holy. Do not make yourself unclean by any creature that moves along the ground. I am the Lord who brought you up out of Egypt to be your God. Therefore be holy, because I am holy. God was showing himself to this people group. And unlike the gods of the nations round about, God was the Lord of the universe, the creator of anything. There was only one God. He's separate, different, holy, perfect, ethically perfect. That's very different from the gods that they were used to, surrounded within the land of Egypt. And God wanted them to be set apart for him, because God wanted to work through this people group to reach out to the nations of the world. And he wanted them to be characteristically different, holy, set apart, marked out in some way. So behind these rules and principles, there's something very, very deep. These are the regulations, he goes on, concerning animals, birds, every living thing that moves about in the water, every creature that moves on the ground. You must distinguish between the unclean and the clean, between living creatures that may be eaten and those that may not be eaten. This people group was to be marked out as different. And one of the great differences that is very obvious is in what they eat. They had a different sacrificial system from any other group, running on completely different principles. Now this is reflected again, the same principles, in what they were to eat. You can summarize it that way. Now there's a principle. This people group were to be set apart as God's people. They were to be different by their choice. They would choose not to do certain things. They would choose to do other things. They were reflecting the very nature of God himself, set apart, different, holy. And it's interesting if you go fast forward to the days of Jesus, when the Jewish people had scattered throughout the Roman Empire. They were marked out as a different type of people. They were noticed. They made an impact that was positive. Their leadership failed, but the people made an impact, and their food laws were part of it. That's the fundamental goal. Now there's something very deep here for the people of God in the churches of the West today. We've got to think this through. We've lost our distinctiveness. We've conformed to the standards and cultures all around. We need to be visibly different in how we behave and what we do. Not by food laws, not by food rules, but by the quality of our living and what we do and what we don't do. There's something very, very important here. Fundamental principle. But we, God's people, are called to be different, to be marked out by the quality of how we behave. A visible expression that God is different. We are not conforming to the people groups around. We're now a tiny minority in the West. And most of us are tending to be pushed and squeezed into the mold of the culture that is around us. God's people are different. And we express the God that we serve and worship. That's the fundamental principle underpinning the food laws. And there's something there that is extremely important for God's people today. If we look at the Jewish people who are left today, many of them are marked out because they still hang on to these food laws. And they still hang on to some of the rituals of their religion. If you look at the Islamic world today, they are marked out. Marked out by the fact that in their societies things just stop on the Fridays at the call to prayer. Eating stops during the hours of daylight during Ramadan. And the women are dressed differently. Now we may look at that and we may think that's a mistake, and it is a mistake, because they've hung on to the past. But the principle behind it is there. What we, the people of God, the followers of Jesus, what we have got to do is to find out what is the present and the future. Because we are a visible expression of God Himself and the way of Jesus. How are we different? Do we stand out? That is our calling. But in the context of Leviticus, it was a practical guidance for a people moving forward to a new environment, and you've got to interpret it in terms of where these people were at. They had just emerged from slavery. They were surviving in a desert. They didn't know where they were going. And they resisted the leadership of Moses quite a lot. But they had a destiny. The nation was to be set apart for God, to make God known to the people groups round about. Because the location of the land they were going into is the bridge between Africa, Europe and Asia. The trade routes go through it. And the message of the nature of God could be spread amongst humanity. These are visible reminders of their destiny as a nation and the purposes of God. And we've got to see that and interpret that for today. And as the people of God today, we've got to work it through in what we do and in the quality of our living. And indeed in the things that we don't do, even though our society is trying to pressurize us into conforming to them. Food laws are now irrelevant. The purpose of Israel is finished. Because from that nation came Jesus. Jesus has made God accessible to all humanity. He personified Israel, as Isaiah showed. But as the followers of Jesus, we are called to be distinctive by our lifestyle. That is the message of Leviticus and the challenge for us today. In the next presentation, we're going to take uncleanness further beyond the food laws into the other areas.